And welcome back everyone to the long-awaited King's Indian full repertoire for the black pieces exclusively for VIP patrons. And I would like to start off by saying that I am actually going to record a full King's Indian repertoire for Chessbase next month, but a small disclaimer that my directions are completely different. So in this repertoire, which I'm going to show you now, we always go, well, in 99% of the cases, we go for d6 and knight d7 setups, which makes the whole memorization process quite easy, and also the preparation aspect, because you don't have to think, okay, here I go e5, here I go c5, here I put the knight to c6, here I put the knight to a6. But in this repertoire, we're mostly focusing on knight d7 setups. And I was actually quite surprised that, because the setups with knight d7 do have this kind of reputation that it's not the best way of playing and arguably a bit of a passive way of playing, but I actually managed to find quite a lot of interesting and very playable ideas. And there are only like one or two lines which are a bit risky for black to play, but first of all, white needs to find there, and still I think the practical aspect of the King's Indian should never be underestimated, and I think that all of the positions we're gonna get are certainly playable. I would like to start this video by going through a couple of the main positional and strategical and also tactical ideas, and after that we're gonna go and have a look at the theory which I'm about to suggest for you. So as I said, we're gonna start with a couple of the main ideas, and I put some diagrams in my PGN file, which of course you're gonna get as well, and we're just gonna go through some of the key ideas which you really need to know to play the King's Indian. So first of all, here we see a position in a line which I also play with the white pieces with the double Fianchetto, and here it's already a very important idea to understand that you should not go e5 too soon. The main thing is that if you go e5 here and take, then this pawn on e5 is often just, white can just grab it. And another thing is knight g4, which black very often plays. I had many games here with the white pieces as well, is not really what you want, because then you get some position like this quite often, and white is just a lot better because this bishop on g2 is very strong. We do get similar positions in the repertoire, but then often the white pawn is already on e4, which of course restricts the bishop on g2. So what I propose here is to start with rook e8, and after c4, it's again important not to play e5 right away, because again we cannot recapture with the pawn because of knight takes e5, and at the very end the piece on e5 is hanging and white just won a pawn here. So that's why here an important idea is for black to play c6 first, wait for white to play knight c3, and only then to go e5, because now if white captures, then we can just take back, and this is the type of structure we really want, especially against the double Fianchetto setup. So let's head on to the next one. The London, of course, very important as well. Nowadays, one of the main openings actually after 1d4. And in this King's Indian type of setup here, we put the knight to c6. This is one of the rare cases. I'm quite sure that you could also play with knight d7 here, but I very much like this approach here with knight c6. And here, if white does not play c3, there's this very nice idea that black can play e5 right away. And after d takes e5, now knight e4. And now black is ready to capture back on e5, and he cannot take on d6 because the pawn on b2 is hanging, and black would just be winning material. This does not work if white starts with c3, but here black can go knight d7 and then e5 on the next move, followed by f5, for example, like this, and black often gets very nice play on the king side, for example, with g5, g4 in some cases. Maybe to explain also here why we cannot do this here after knight d7, it's also playable, but here white can play c4 in one go. He didn't play c3 just yet, and now at least white has faster play on the queen side. Maybe even c5 in some case could be considered for him just to open up the center. So let's head on to the next position. This is right here. It comes from the g3 King's Indian, where also we go for the knight bd7 line. And here there's a very nice strategical idea, which when I first saw it, when I started playing the King's Indian, I was very much fascinated by it. So white's last move was queen d2 here. And there's the very nice idea for black to play h4 now. And after g4 now, knight h7. And what you want to do is, for example, if white goes rook d1, now you want to go g5 and completely clamp down white's structure on the king side, and then continue with, for example, bishop e5 check, king goes away, and then knight e6. And the position is very, very strange, I would say, but in the long run, black has very nice control of the dark squares, and especially the bishop on g2 is not a great piece. So black has ideas to just put the knight to f4. In some case, play c6 if the d6 pawn is not hanging, and black gets pretty good chances. You could also think of regrouping this knight to g6 as well, and then to put it to f4. So that's another very important idea here, to play h4. There are also some tactical ideas sometimes to sacrifice on g4, but definitely keep in mind this idea with knight h7 followed by g5. The next one, which we don't see quite often in this repertoire, is in this position. It's still a very important strategical idea, is that whenever this knight is on g3 from white, we can often go for h5 and then trying to go h4 on the next move. Maybe for understanding, it's always also good to understand why white shouldn't play h4. I mean, maybe in this position it's actually not a bad move, but there is a downside for it for white, because now we can go knight c6, now we're ready to play e5, and generally what we really would like to get is a position like this where we can get the knight to d4. So this is what white should definitely avoid. And now after d5, which is a typical reaction, now we can go knight e5, and now white cannot go f4 comfortably anymore, because we can put the knight to g4, and white has already played h4. So that's why it's important to understand that knight c6 immediately would be possible as well, but if we have a look at this now the knight is not nearly as comfortable on g4, because white can just kick it out with h3. So the next line right here, this comes through the bishop d3 line, and I'm not going for the main system here because I think that white actually has practical chances there, but instead I saw a game by Magnus Carlsen which he played in Title Tuesday, and we can get this position right here. And a theme which we often see in the King's Indian is that we really want to exchange our bishop on g7 against white's bishop on e3, and right here that works quite well for black if he goes bishop h6, which was also played by Magnus. And of course you lose some time with the rook, but anyway, black is then gonna go rook h8 back. In some cases we're just gonna castle artificially like this. Even Magnus in the game later on castled queenside, which of course doesn't always work, but it's definitely an idea to keep in mind, especially if white castles queenside himself as well. So another important idea with bishop h6, definitely keep that in mind. The next position we reach through the 5h3 line. Here again, our move orders I think are quite smart, and they're gonna throw some of our opponents off guard. But one of the critical positions can come like this. And here it's important, when white gains all the space on the king side, that we need to look for counterplay immediately. One way to do that would be to play on the queen side, which we already started here with a5 and a4. Often queen a5 can come as well, then c takes d5 and sometimes b5 later on, just to get play on the queen side. But there's also the aspect to look for counterplay on the king side, and a way to do that here is to play f6. Just opening up the f-file for the rook. And what I didn't even think about while preparing this, that there's another very nice idea, which I'm just going to put it on the board. For example, if white goes queen c2, what we can sometimes do is, after taking here, then go rook f4. That's a very typical idea in the King's Indian as well. Now the pawn on g5 would be attacked, and if white captures here, then of course we're down in exchange, but now look at the beautiful bishop on g7, how it's opening up. And black often in those positions has just fantastic compensation just because of the super strong bishop on g7. So that's another important idea to keep in mind as well in those structures with rook f4. So the next position, now we have two positions from the Sämisch variation, where we also go for e5, which I think most players would not expect, because it's a very old line and people think that it's just bad. And this is a typical position which could come, and here there's this nice motive for black to play b5, and after c takes b5, sacrificing the pawn, and here just to open up the whole center with d5, and black already has very, very nice compensation for the pawn and super good attacking chances on the queen side later on. So that's the first idea. Especially if white castles queenside, we very often want to play with b5, just to, even if we're giving up a pawn, just to break open the whole queen side and weaken white's king. But this is the idea which I'm most proud of for presenting, or one of the ideas. This comes through the Sämisch after e5, d5, and now knight fd7, which is a very rare idea, and there's quite a funny point behind it. If white goes for the most natural or logical move, bishop e3 here, now we want to go bishop h6. So again, the same idea like we saw earlier, but here it works tactically, because if white captures on h6, then after queen h4 check, we're gaining back the piece, and of course that was a fantastic exchange for us, because we got rid of the often passive bishop on g7, and here black doesn't have any problems at all. There were some games which went like this, but black can go a5, go knight a6, knight c5 in some case, and of course later on also break the center with f5, and black has a very comfortable endgame. So the next position is right here after queen c2, and a very typical idea for black to play in the King's Indian, which I haven't even talked about yet, is of course to play for f5 very, very often, just to fight in the center and trying to make some more space for the pieces. It's often the question, how do you get that? Of course, you need to move the knight from f6 to play f5, and if it's possible, in most cases you want to go knight h5, because then you also have ideas with knight f4 later on. So that's a very important idea for you guys to remember as well. So the next position is right here, and with this bishop being on h4, we often see that black has a couple of different ideas to play against that. In this exact position, it's often an idea to play g5, and after bishop g3, now to play f5. That's probably the strongest here, and white mostly has to capture, otherwise f4 is threatening to win the bishop on g3. And what we get here is another typical King's Indian position. White, of course, has the e4 square for his knights, but on the other hand, we have the d4 square for our knight. And this knight often goes to c5, especially if white goes knight e4. Then what we often do is go b6 first and then knight c5, so that we can recapture with the b pawn. So that's another important idea right here. The next one is in a position like this, for example. We saw an idea like that already earlier, but here, of course, we again want to activate this bishop on g7, and we can do that nicely by just going bishop h6. And at some moment, this knight on d2 is probably going to have to move. Already now, maybe bishop takes d2 is a threat, followed by knight takes e4. And whenever the knight moves, then we can exchange this bishop. For example, one game went queen c2, and now knight e8, preparing f5, and after a3, anyway, f5. Bishop on h6 is now activated, and black has no problems whatsoever. So now we are already moving on. Let me start with this position right here, which is very similar to what we just saw with the bishop on h4. And if white has already played f3, there's this strategical idea again to play bishop h6. And this bishop often wants to go to e3 even. And if then white goes king h1, the bishop often just stays on this diagonal. It goes maybe to d4, maybe to c5, but it's very happy to go on this long diagonal. Because also then white's king is kind of stuck on h1, and there are often some tactical motives to make use of that, as we will see later. So we already jumped here now, but let's continue with the next King's Indian structure like this. Since we played knight bd7 setup, this is something which we can very often get. And here it's important to notice two things. The first one is that the d4 square is weak, and especially in endgames, if black still has the knight and white is stuck with this bishop, for example, then we can just make use of the d4 square forever. And strategically speaking, then black has a very good position if he can manage that. But of course, here there are still many pieces on the board, and that's why bringing the knight to d4 yet, d4 square is still nicely protected, but yeah, it's not going to do anything just yet for black. So there's the other plan for black, which is to play on the king side with the move knight h5. And this knight is going to go to f4. And after that, already black has ideas like queen f6, some sacrifices on h3. Often this knight then again goes through c5 to e6 as well, or via f8 to e6. And another idea quite often is if the knight is already on f4, there is this move to play g5 as well, to then start the attack with h5 and g4. But of course, you need to be very careful by playing a move like g5, because it does also weaken the f5 square as well. So let's continue with the next position. That one was right here. And about this exact structure, I have to say that we try to avoid it in this repertoire, but sometimes we can go here. And one rule which you can remember is that whenever white goes h3 in those positions, for example right here, then we can comfortably take on d4, and after knight takes d4, rook e8. Now the move which white really wants to make in all cases is the move f3, just to protect e4. And now with this move h3 already being played, white has a significant weakness, which is the g3 square, and therefore we can make use of that here by going knight h5. Often the knight goes to g3. Sometimes we even have ideas with bishop e5 to then put the queen to g3 and play for a checkmate attack. And also, of course, there's the idea to play f5, since white can never take because the bishop on e3 is hanging. And after f5, of course, we're putting pressure on e4, and sometimes there's even the idea to just block the center with f4 then, and then to just go for a full kingside attack later on. So the next position right here, this is something we can also get quite often, and this is actually a motive which is important for white here. So after c5, we get a very typical King's Indian type of position. And of course, black is trying to play on the king side here, in most cases, and white is going to try and play on the queen side with a3 and b4. And there is this strategical idea for white, which is one of the biggest problems, I would say, in this line. But I don't think that all players are going to know it, especially on the amateur level. On master level plus, I'm sure that many people are aware of it. And it's the idea of playing bishop g5 here. And white is actually losing quite a lot of time with this. But the idea is that white wants to provoke black to play h6 here and then just go back to d2. And the idea behind this is now that whenever black wants to go for f5, for example, after knight h7, which is another typical idea for black and the best way to play, after g3 now, we often have issues to play f5, because now after knight h4, white is attacking this weak pawn on g6, and we just have some weaknesses on the king side. So this is a very important idea for white to try and create weaknesses on the king side. But also keep in mind this idea for black to play knight h7. But we are now, if white goes g3, we are now not really going for f5 just yet, but we are bringing all of the attackers on the king side with knight df6. And then we have ideas like king h8, knight g8, then maybe f5 if we can prepare it nicely. Another idea is, of course, to always exchange this bishop. For example, we can go king h8, knight g8, h5, and bishop h6 just to exchange it. Those positions, computers don't like it at all for black, but practically speaking, black has definitely his chances, and like from practical games, you can see many where black just ends up having a very strong kingside attack. And also g3 is a weakening move. Probably he has to play it, otherwise if he doesn't play g3, we're ready to play f5. But it is a weakening move, because if we look at this h3 square right here, a bishop or a knight could appear there, and then white's king doesn't really have so many defenders after all as well. Okay, so the next position is here. We've already seen ways to activate the bishop, and this is also the best way for black to do it right here, by going bishop f6. And very often we can even sacrifice the pawn on h6. For example, here, I'm sure that the bishop would even get trapped. If we go, for example, f4, this bishop is not going to go out anymore. And otherwise, we're just ready to play bishop g5. And then, especially now that white played h3 and f3, let's just say white goes for a move like queen c2. If you look at the position like this, then we can see that white has all the holes on the dark squares here, especially after we exchange his bishop on e3. And we definitely have many attacking ideas like knight f6, knight h5, knight f4. I would definitely pick black here already. So the next position is right here. Another one of those where black has captured on d4. Again, we saw earlier that when white played h3, often we can take on d4. Once again, if f3, then we can definitely consider knight h5 followed by knight g3 or f5. But here there's another idea of white goes bishop f3 here, which is to go knight h7, followed by knight g5, and then the bishop on f3 is quite awkward, and we are also still having quite of a nice pressure on the pawn on e4. So that's another nice idea to keep in mind. The next position is right here. Again, one of the positions we saw earlier. This is one of my main lines in the file, actually, in the main line of the classical King's Indian with knight bd7. And here, once again, it's important to play knight h5 with black, and then to start an attack with knight f4, knight e6, sometimes f5, as we saw earlier. For example, there was a game like this. And then queen f6. This is what I was talking about earlier, especially if this bishop is on f1. Now we already have the serious threat of taking on h3. So another important idea. And of course, as I said earlier, g5, h5, g4 can be an idea as well, sometimes. Now we are already heading to the last position. This is my main line in the file and probably the best which white can get. And here I'm proposing a very interesting novelty. White already had to find a couple of moves to even get here. For example, here c5 was very important. Otherwise, black would get knight c5. The point is that black cannot take here, since after knight d5, bishop takes c5, we're losing the exchange on f8. So that brings me to the novelty which I'd like to propose to you, which is the funny looking move rook g8. And now knight takes c5 is a threat, because we just stepped out of this diagonal with the rook. And another idea of rook g8 can very often be that later on we have attacking ideas with g5 and g4, especially after the bishop moves to f8. And black definitely has counterplay on the king side in those positions. And first of all, white needs to worry about how to defend the pawn on c5. Probably b4 is the best. But yeah, we're gonna have a closer look at that in the theoretical section. But until then, I hope this was useful just to get a grasp of what are the main ideas, both strategically and tactically, in the King's Indian, which I'm about to show you. So we're gonna see each other in the theoretical section in a second.